On the Infrastructure Finance Committee report. Yes. Okay. All right. So. No, you looked for the one that was a defective and one of the pedals were going to come down, and that's what you gave me. I saw you look. Would you do that for me? I know, that's the problem. It does need the bottom broken off. How did you break your bottom off? Okay, here we go. Priorities. So, I'm going to give you an overview picture of kind of where we are in this process, what the expectations for the board are, and then take any questions that we have. So this all started, as you probably remember, from the request from Mr. Moon to Sharon Bulova about increasing our bonding capacity by $25 million. And then Chairman Bulova decided to put together a joint committee with the two boards, 3 members from each. So the committee has worked over many months. We came up with what is a consensus report. There were a lot of tangents that we talked about, but we really didn't go down too many of those rabbit holes. We tried to focus on the financial piece. So what you see here is a consensus of what we could get to. So you have to know there's still differences of opinion. There's still time for us to say we still want to pursue certain things, but this is a great starting point. What is going to happen now in the process, and I don't know how many of you watched it last Tuesday at the Board of Supervisors meeting. John Cook did a brief presentation about this report to their board. And it is on the agenda for March 18, the day we have the budget. When I spoke with Susan Data about that, Susan was very concerned that we don't have enough time to get into this report. She was going to make a recommendation to Chairman Bulova that we schedule another joint meeting between the two boards, but I have not had any feedback. I don't know what's going to happen with that. The goal is to get our board to accept this report. This is what I'll work on with our chairman. I don't know. We'll talk about it today. I don't know if we would have it for new business and then action moving forward, but at least we'll have the advantage of having somewhat of a discussion with the supervisors about this on March 18. There are also 3 attachments with the report, and I'll reference those in a couple of key points in the report. In my mind, this isn't a report that our board would change before we would accept it, but if we had certain points we wanted to make, I think we could do that, or do those in a meeting with the Board of Supervisors. So, I want you to know that your 3 school board members that represented you on this committee fought for our rights to ensure that we took care of what we needed to do. So when you look at the report, there were 2 preliminary recommendations, and those are really to share information. One of the things that came out of the county is a feeling that once our board saw the 10 principles of financial management, that we would agree to the fact that we didn't need, it was okay, they don't give us more money for bonding. I don't know that we totally agree with that. So one of the things we put in that recommendation is when we get the presentation from county staff about that, we also want to see specific examples of the impact of additional bond sales up to $25 million. The other thing that we asked for then is that the Board of Supervisors get the presentation that our staff did that shows our cost, our square foot per student. We had a great presentation. All of this is on the web if you want to see it, that really explain how cost effective we are with what we do with facilities. So we thought it was important for their entire board to see that. Those meetings are the piece that Susan Data referenced. Maybe it would be one meeting. We talked about it maybe being separate meetings for each board. I don't have details of where that would go yet. The rest of the report is broken out into goal areas that the committee worked with. Some of the information is straightforward. Some of it's a little more nuanced. I'm not going to go through every piece. I'm just going to hit a few highlights in the report. So the first section I'm going to skip. The next section in Goal 2, with these definitions of what operations and maintenance are, infrastructure replacement and upgrades. The real sticking point was in the definition for number 2. Because we can't affect our revenue. We don't make, we are dependent upon other people for our revenue. One of the things we've done for many, many years is we put roofs for bonding. We put HVAC in bonding. Things that last 20 years, which can be bonded, we bond. And on the county side, they do more of, and was Jeff around? He'll save me if I say the wrong things. Okay. They do pay as you go for roofs and things. They don't bond it. So they want to push us to do that. Your school board members on the committee fought to say, okay, that might be a good place to go, but it's going to be dependent on whether we get enough revenue to do that. So that was important to keep that flexibility in that definition. Then you can see in the report the bolded parts are new ideas. In D, setting up this capital sinking fund, this was another area where revenue does make a difference. And your school board members on the committee talked about the fact that the critical requirements that would get funded first before you saw if you had extra revenue to put into the sinking fund, our beginning balance is an important piece of that. So we made it clear to them that until we get enough revenue to get rid of our budget deficit, that it's going to limit how much money we would be able to put into this sinking fund. But we thought it was a great idea to do it because we know from both sides we are underfunding those areas. And the other part of this, and this was an idea I think that mostly came out of John Cook, if you go by this definition that roofs and HVAC and some of those other things that we bond should come out of operations, what they're saying is the county will provide to us about $13 million that would go into our capital fund, construction fund, I'm sorry. And that would free up $13 million of bonding, so then you would have more money for renovations. You know, I'm going to come back to what my father told me, that if is the biggest word in the English language. So if this all works out, that's a great way to free up some money for bonding. We did ensure that in here it says this increase in the transfer shall not affect in any way consideration of the county transfer of the school operating fund. We originally tried to get this to be coming from year-end money because we didn't want to tie the two things for the transfer increase and this construction piece. We wanted to keep that piece separate. Goal 4 about the joint use, you'll see one of the attachments, attachment C, is the cooperation between county and schools. And that document came about around the time we were working on Graham Road Elementary School and trying to have cooperation, to have some county services in our schools. You can see it wasn't that effective, but the committee's recommending that both boards go back to saying we support this. I think it makes sense. It's always the hard part's the outcome if that work does happen. Goal 5 gets into some of the issues with the meat of where the funding is going to be. So the areas we came up with was the $13.1 million. The next section in B on page 7 originally came up with the idea, I think John Faust mentioned this, well, should the county do an extra penny on the tax rate to help with construction costs, facilities costs? And then through discussion of the committee, it was decided, let's not talk where the $20 million comes from, but it talked about the county having $20 million that we could use for facilities things. Originally, this said schools and county. They added in parks. We tried to get them to take out parks. But what we did get in there, that annually, if they do this money, annually somebody would look at the formula and decide how much we get. So it's not a one-time decision. The last section, suggestions not adopted, and I think these are things where we did work to make sure that we kept these discussions open, was the meals tax. There's great information on the IFC website about the meals tax, but we said that this is something that the Board of Supervisors still needs to look at. the proffer stuff, that was something that Pat Harity suggested, but that wasn't something for our committee to look at. That's something for the whole board. And then in C, I think we got the best language we could get out of the committee, that the committee has discussed the county's concerns with increasing the bond sales by an additional $25 million. I still think that that's something our board needs to address and get an answer from their whole board. So that's kind of an overview of where we got. The committee's not planning to meet anymore, and I'm open for questions about the report.
I just
okay,
have
Patty?
a question, and that is, how do you want to guide this discussion? Is there a particular question you want the board to ask, or are you just asking for comments? Do we have to approve the report? What are you thinking?
I think that the goal is from the committee, and what we talked about is having both boards approve the report. I don't know what the schedule is for the supervisors, and that's where I referenced in the beginning whether we would make it new business. March 20, I think, is the next meeting, and then vote on it the next meeting. So the goal is to ask any questions you would have so that you would be able to help approve the report. Does that make sense? Okay. Elizabeth?
So this is just going to piggyback on the conversation that you and I had this weekend. Help me understand, have you arrived at basically it's either this or nothing, like there's no further discussion, or how does that play into the successive, like a number 2 joint meeting between this board and their board? Because the main issue I have with this is the fact that Parks got added, as if Parks is not the county. And that's one of my major pullbacks, is that all of a sudden they become 2/3 and we're 1/3, and we're right back to, it's the wrong discussion, because there's, a kind of a gray line, and on that side is the county, and on this side is the school system, and all the money, goes and encompasses all of us, and the parks is that side. So if you start bifurcating, trifurcating, their quadrant and say, oh, well, they've got to provide for the park, well, that's the county. And so I don't know if that's something that could be a topic of discussion in front of both boards, but I think it's incumbent upon us to make that part known, that no, you have your side and you've got to handle your priorities, but we're one and you're one.
So there's a couple of ways that I was thinking about this. One, we can accept the report, but the board has the following concerns, comments, or whatever about the report. Because remember, it's only 3 people from each board. So I think that's one way to handle it. If we have a meeting, which I think would be a preference with both boards together, then this can be part of the discussion. I don't see this as something we could go in and change the report, because the report is the report. But I think we could add comments to it.
Okay, so that would be my advocacy, is that we certainly look to another joint meeting. I think the more we do joint meetings with them rather than the less, the more advantageous it is, because we have opportunity to bring these issues forward. Clearly, the slide into second base on bringing another party to this report, and that all of a sudden now they have 2 parties and we just have one, is, I'm going to say, slightly just disingenuous. So my second recommendation would be that we acknowledge that that the report is the work of the joint committee, but that in light of the bigger board, that we have, and whatever concerns anybody else might have, but that we list the concerns, that there is not an equitable understanding here of there's 2 parties at the table when we're talking about the money, and that's the county side and the school side.
Thank you. Sandy, did you want to address this?
I did, and I wanted to say that I certainly don't see this as the end of the conversation at all. We need to keep this conversation going. As far as the 20 million, there is not an assumption that it would be 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. It talks about how the staffs would have to go and talk about that later. So that was not part of this. In fact, at one point, one of the supervisors mentioned, well, you would get 10 million from that, and 13 from the other, so 23 is pretty close to the 25 you're looking at. But I do think you've hit on an interesting point about proportions, and I'll bring that up when it's my turn to talk about the proportion of the bonding that we get. But I don't think this is the end of the conversation at all.
And I would just say, Ms. Evans, that I think you're exactly right, and that was my fear, is that all of a sudden, if we're playing two giants, instead of one, then we become the third wheel, and now, the parks are advocating for something that is really just a subset of the county. And so it's not that I don't respect the parks, but there's two boards here, and that is a subset of the county side.
Okay, so my other advice I want to make clear to the board is, even though in this report they don't increase our bond sales authority, I don't think we give up on that. I think that's an answer we need from their whole board. I mean, we know from being in that committee, the county executive and their budget director and the 3 members there weren't willing to say, we'll increase that 155. But that's a subset of the group. I think if our board still wants that to happen, we have to directly still question their board. I think I had Janie next.
Okay, I have questions on the recommendations. First on A, where it talks about 13.1 million annually and then freeing up 13.1 million in bond funding. Are they indicating actual freeing up debt service or simply cash flow resulting from bond sales? Because it's a different number.
What they're saying, and Jeff will help me, is that when they give us the 13.1 in the construction fund, those things that we bond, the roofs, the HVAC, those type of things will no longer be part of the 155. So now we'll be able to renovate a little bit more.
So they're just talking about cash flow.
It's a shift.
It's a shift.
Right, it's just
the shift.
It's just paying for it out of one pocket instead of
Exactly. What we would do is we'd find 13.1 million of major maintenance, and we would move it to the operations fund, and we'd pay for it out of this money, and that means we would get to do 13.1 million more in other things.
All right, and
on the
then,
list.
of course, then the trust factor of whether or not that actually would be paid for irrespective of our operating. And part of the issue over the years is we've put as much into bond funding in order so that our infrastructure capital needs are not competing with teachers. And so we go back to that and whether or not that actually would hold over time. So that would be my one question there. One recommendation that we privately raise money for our building needs. That was one of the other recommendations. Were they serious about that? Given the amount of money that it takes to...
That's probably a recommendation that I've ignored because I don't think we're really going to hire somebody to go out and find money for that. But
yeah,
that
and
was in there.
then the other issue on B, again, the pay-as-you-go funding, if they were thinking of putting, part of that 20 million would be the 13.1 million? No, that's separate. Okay, that is a separate piece. I know part of the Board of Supervisors' frustration is the parks are run by a park authority board, which is also sort of an independent group. So, and politically, it's always very difficult for them. And I guess the sinking fund, I would love to know from Mr. Plattenberg, because I know the county has a gazillion sinking funds, and whether or not it's a good idea or a bad idea to get into this pond since we don't control our own revenues, and whether or not if we commit to a sinking fund, does that then commit us to less money for covering growth in student population?
So that's the crux of what we talked about a lot. And Susan Quinn was involved, and Susan was very helpful from the budgeting aspect. If they provide that money, if it doesn't affect the transfer increase, yeah, we could fund those things like that. But we don't control our revenue.
And I guess then my question is, if they were willing to somehow help us put together this sinking fund in this way. Did they ever bring up the fact that we have a growing student population? I mean, it's sort of interesting where there seems to be interest in movement here with infrastructure, but as we were struggling with being able to hire the personnel to actually teach the children who would go to school in these buildings.
We tried to add language that talked about that $13 million wasn't static, that it should grow and change.
Right.
And we couldn't get approval to add that. I don't think we ended up adding that language, right? They wanted to keep it the same amount because we tried to add language that said it would change.
It would be 16.
Yeah.
And so then when we talk about a sinking fund, if we actually went down the road of a sinking fund, would we then be obligated forever to do that? In other words, if we found that it didn't work, because I don't, since we've never been able to have a sinking fund and they have them, what are the policy implications of that for us?
So remember, their board hasn't talked about this yet either, so they've got to decide they want to give us the funding. I think with anything we do, you have to be strategic going forward and seeing if it works. And that's some of our fear about starting to say, okay, we're going to pull these things out of bonding. We're going to have to be very cautious moving forward. And one of the things we talked about, this would be something that could be developed over time as you got the resources.
And then the last question on the impact, the policy impact on bonding, because we have gone towards bonding some of the technology infrastructure and actual technology for schools, because we've always struggled when a school is renovated or countywide to be able to afford the technology. And I know in the bond rating houses, that's always been a little interesting piece of discussion, whether or not you can bond technology. If we actually took these pieces out, would we run into difficulty with how we struggle to also do our technology piece? That's kind of a policy
Well,
issue.
I think it's part of what they find problem with how much we're putting in on the bond side and the life cycle of some of that,
Right.
Of some of those items.
Yeah, because we've pushed it over time.
Yes, but that's not, we're not unique in that way.
No, I know.
As school systems across the country have been, the resources have become very, very tight. A lot of that has been moved to, bonding, infrastructure. I mean, more
Right.
capital side. I think the real cautionary tale here is really making sure that it's very clear that we don't create expectations that we fund major maintenance on the operations side.
Exactly.
That we would only be able to fund the $13.1 million specifically.
Okay, good. That
Right,
answers
and
my
I think
question.
that's the
Right, exactly.
what we have to be really careful, because if we say yes to this, and then next year, then we have some kind of expectation that no, we're only paying for major maintenance out of the operations side of the budget. That would be very problematic for us.
Right, because I was going to say that what I find in talking with the community, that particularly older people that don't have children in schools, it's very easy for them to be able to see our needs on the facility side because they see the trailers. They sort of understand bricks and mortar. It's very hard to explain the need for teachers to teach the children. And so this always looks very inviting because it looks like a hard thing that everybody understands, and yet there are policy implications over time. So thanks.
And part of the trust issue, and it really helps us, I think, is that this wouldn't be, that $13 million just doesn't go into our budget. It goes into the construction fund, so it keeps it separate. I have Megan and then Sandy.
Okay, the first one is that I had asked Ms. Smith about this, and I was hoping to maybe just have all of us think about how we can possibly get this noted in the report somewhere or through board discussion when we vote on it. But it was so compelling to learn that we have 81% of the square footage in building space, and they've got 19%. And I had so hoped that this report would, at minimum, have those figures in here that breaks down not just that ratio, but then the ratio of how much bond money goes to the county side versus to the school side, because I think that just tells the story right there. And so, Ms. Smith, I was wondering if you could please just kind of summarize why we don't see that in this report at all? And is there any way we can somehow, because I think both boards need to know those numbers if it didn't make it in the report, and how can we do that?
And, that's the hard part, because when you look at square foot of buildings and you're comparing that, and maybe it's data we need to pull together in a different way, because what else is it that they bond? And it's a different situation for them because we do this just went out of my head, general obligation bonds, but they can also use economic development bonds. So, and this was a question I didn't follow up with Jeff enough, that we talk about the square footage difference compared to the percentage of bonding they get, but I couldn't tell you off the top of my head what else they put in their bonding. So anything with roads or other pieces like that. So is there a way for us to have a good picture of that, to talk about, you should give us a greater percentage? And therein lies one of the hardest parts when we deal with them, because really their perception is always we should cut more.
And that's why I really wanted to raise the point now at this work session, because I think you get that, statistic accurately reflected somewhere in relation to this report, and that's where the conversation, not only between the two boards, but quite frankly for the public to understand, why are we in this very difficult predicament?
And average age of facilities as well.
That's my second
another
question after we figure out this question.
Well, there was a lot of discussion about this. I mean, clearly one of the points that was pointed out is that we all have an aging infrastructure. The county had some flexibility, more flexibility, because of the funding. And at the end of the fiscal years, in years past, when there was funding available, they were able to take care of. That's why the pay-go, that's why they talked about that. They have previously given us money for things, a certain amount, for doing some extra work, if you will, in your imbalances. And in regards to Economic Development Authority bonds, and working with the community members who pointed that out and sent us that, we thought that was very healthy information, because it really reflected a disparity, again, on in terms of the amount and the size and what it's used for. So long story short is that because they control much more of the revenue picture, they have much more flexibility in the resources to afford and not afford. In terms of the report and what was included in the report and what wasn't, if we were to request more of the data, which we felt was compelling to say the least, to be included in that, then there was, well, what do we include, what don't we include? That's why they were so keen on having a briefing about bond financing 101 and all these other things, because a lot of different information came up. We got into paths, then, as you mentioned, the Park Authority, a number of different rabbit holes kind of like cropped up along the way to get us to where this trust document came about.
But,
So
yeah,
let me just try this question for a second. So I know Kevin Sneed came up with that chart that showed how many square feet we have and how many square feet the county has in looking at the bonding. But what else do they bond that gives us the full 100%, that gives us the full 100% picture of why they're taking that percentage of the bonding they're taking, even though we have so many more square feet? Am I making sense with that?
You are. The 110 million versus the 155 that we get currently. I don't know exactly what they pay for out of their bonding. There are charts that do identify what it is. We didn't get that clarified, really, or it wasn't clearly identified. It wasn't that it wasn't available. I don't think anyone asked what exactly are you paying out of that 110 million. I think it was more of the shock of the disparity between the amount of square footage and the amount of bond funding provided each.
the reason I ask is when I served on the turf task force, one of the ways that we really were able to come up with that joint recommendation of, look, the county's going to, put 1.5 mil in for the next 3 years, and we'll get this whole thing, financed for the rest of our schools, because what we were able to demonstrate is the county side through its parks and recs and youth groups versus the school side, it was almost a 50-50 usage in these synthetic turf fields. And so the idea being is, well, if it's a 50-50 usage, then it's a 50-50 bring your money to the table. And so that, to me, was kind of what I'd hoped with this whole bond discussion was, you know what, if it's apples to apples, if it's 60-40 that the schools have that much square footage of the buildings, then we get 60% of the bonding. So that's where ideally what I'm envisioning, Ms. Smith, is I would like to, if possible, if this is going to go to the regular business meeting, we're going to vote on it, I'd like that we could maybe have an addendum where we get to have amendments that say, thank you, committee, and we, vote to approve the report, this joint report, but our board, by majority vote, has these, amendments that, or addendums that we wanted to deliver to both boards and be mindful of. And I'd love to work with anybody who wants to on that, but I think that's a key piece that if it didn't get it in the report, then let's figure out some way to get that really important statistic accurately reflected in this joint.
So, Megan, I'm going to suggest that I work with Jeff and figure out how to ask this question of the county, because we did ask questions back and forth, kind of like budget questions, and get this clarified so we have the whole big picture. Because if we are wrong in only comparing square foot to square foot because they bond other things in this, we need to know that. We want to make sure we represent it the right way.
Absolutely,
So let me
yeah.
get that answer before the time frame when we need to take action.
I'm only tossing out that's really important to me, and I think it would be a good lobbying piece. The second question I have, and it did go to what Dr. Garza said, age of the buildings. My Braddock District Planning Commissioner, Nell Hurley, had brought up in some of their planning commission conversations that both on the county side and the school side, we have some of our buildings that we're renovating that are younger than 50 years. And then we've got, as we know, some of our legacy schools that are not. And one of the revolutionary suggestions she had was a joint agreement. I was going to say bipartisan, but it's not politics. But a joint agreement from the two sides to say, you know what, let's try to put a commitment that no county buildings and no school buildings, would be ahead in the queue to be renovated until we finished off our 50-year-old buildings. It was an interesting concept, because I think that for our families whose, children do go to those legacy schools that are still woefully down in the queue, it's not just what we're doing on our side, but even if the county said we would be willing to help make that happen, that these older buildings would see renovation first. It was, to me, just sort of a very novel suggestion. I wondered if that ever got brought up in your discussions.
I think here's the issue, and I know this makes Sandy crazy too. I think the core piece of that is the 155, and they think we have 155 and they have 110, and they don't want to give us any more than what we're getting. That's the key piece there. Sandy, did you want to follow up on that?
Yeah, and I think this is an important issue, both the age of the building and the proportion of the bond sales, which we keep asking them to increase bond sales and give us, increase it by $25 million and give it to us. But I think proportion is an issue too. One of the frustrations I had was that the way they judge their buildings is different from the way we judge ours. We have a way of doing it, and we have our queue, and they have, a letter system, an A through F system, and then they prioritize 1, 2, 3. So you can't really put them side by side. And I think one of the important things for us to try to get at, if we can, is to look at just what is the age of their buildings being renovated now compared to the age of our buildings being renovated now, and what does that tell us? Because, I was looking at some of the things that were going to be renovated soon, the Panino building. And so I'm thinking, really? And Mason District Government Center is a number 2, which is a pretty high priority. Number 2, it's number 1 is the highest priority, number 2. the Mason District Government Center, to my eye, looks fine. And, it was built in brand new in the 1990s. And here it is, a mile and a half from Falls Church High School, built in 1960, redone in 68. So I'm thinking somehow we need to get that side by side and say, wait a minute, you guys they're going faster. They're going faster and farther and sooner.
Megan, did you have anything else?
Just one last thing. I think, Ms. Smith, you mentioned the cost per square footage of our construction costs versus the county's construction costs. I think that's also important. I don't know if I saw that.
And that would be in the presentation. That was one of the presentations that we did that our staff did to the committee that's so excellent. I mean, if you haven't looked at it, you should. But that's the presentation we want their whole board to get.
But how come we don't have any, citations of it in the report? Because what I want is when somebody reads the report, it's in there in black and white that we're being more efficient with our construction costs than they are. And don't we all want to see that kind of fiscal, because what I heard you say is they told us we just need to be better managing our money. And I'm kind of thinking, well, isn't that interesting if it's accurate that their cost per square footage is more than, it's not just us needing to be efficient with tax dollars and bond amounts.
So that's one of the things in their presentation. Pat Harity did ask the question of their staff. He wants to understand their square foot costs. It is an art coming up with a consensus document.
Oh, 10 months I served on the turf task force. I do understand, yes.
And I think it is hard because it's not totally apples to apples. We're looking at schools, they're looking at different kinds of buildings and other pieces like that. So there wasn't exactly a fit just to say, okay, look and compare these things. But I think there are things, especially in the joint meeting, that we should be able to talk about.
Well, Mr. Plattenberg, I'm just throwing it out there. If you have a creative idea of how I could maybe put forward a proposal that just speaks to that in some capacity, I'd welcome it.
Thank you. I have Pat next.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, by the way. I'm sure these were challenging conversations, and I know I appreciate all the work you did. I look at this report, and I do see some places where it looks like the supervisors came across and recognized some needs and are trying to meet them. That said, I wanted to follow up on a couple of things. The co-locating services, I guess that's goal 4. I just wanted to know, because I guess I'm relatively new to the conversation, what are some of the things that have gotten in the way of doing that? Did you talk about that in your meetings?
Not really. I didn't get involved, I know, when Phil Najelski-Eichner was on the board, and they really worked so hard for Graham Road and to get those things to work. In the end, things fell apart. What was the impression I had? That it wasn't working on the county side to get it in there. I don't know enough about the details. I think it's a great commitment, but then how do you work out those pieces of who pays for what and how it works? For some reason, it hasn't been able to work.
So it just sounds like the boards have to make a commitment and then just send it down to staff to make it happen?
But there was that commitment. There's that document that's attached that was passed in 2007 to make that happen.
I can speak a little bit to that point whenever
Good,
you'd
Dan.
like for me to. I was very, very, very aware and conscious and actually talked to Phil a fair amount about what he was doing, because at the time we were trying to build the South County Middle School, and we were looking for ways to get money, frankly, and ways to do that. And Jerry Highland was a huge supporter of community schools. He and I both believe that that's the future of what we want to be doing. And for South County, they didn't need a library because there was one not too far away, but they could use a police station and some other things. And so we actually worked through things, but in the end, there wasn't really the kind of support on the Board of Supervisors to move that forward. That was part of it. The other part of it is it was going to take more time to do that. It's more complex. It's going to be a lot more discussions, and it was going to slow the process down. I know on Graham Road, Phil had a committee that he ran for more than a year, and Dean and others met with the staff. I mean, they spent a lot. They spent more than enough time doing it. But in the end, what I understood is the county did not want to spend the money to house staff there and to pay or have the staff that would work out of that school. So there's going to be an additional cost, and that they ultimately didn't want to pursue that expense. I don't know how much that involved with the Board of Supervisor member, how much it was more of the staff level in the county. But I know, again, where Jerry and I both agreed on Mount Vernon to do this, there was that resistance. There wasn't really much interest in proceeding or pursuing that particular approach.
So it's just not a true commitment. But I know that, like, Kathy Hudgens is very much, she's always talking about it. So maybe we just made a little bit of a coalition of the willing, maybe, to get it going.
And I think our staff, my impression is from all that stuff, our staff was really working towards it. I think our staff worked towards it honorably. That's my impression.
All right, well, thank you. I had another question, so it's just sticky, huh? On proffers, you know, the thing that was suggested to take money out of affordable housing and to put it at the schools, that seems to be the absolute worst thing to take money out of to go to the schools. I mean, our families need affordable housing. So I wondered if any other discussion of proffers was had. I mean, the whole idea of maybe raising proffers to just have more go to the schools. Nothing?
Not really. I don't remember anything getting into details about that. No.
All right. I would also echo Megan's the idea that we have somewhere. Ask that question about the percent of bond money and the percent of square footage, and then the sort of apples to apples on age of buildings and costs, if we can, and whether we just put that in an addendum or something. I think that's good information to have public. Then I had just a couple questions going forward. I noticed that not much transportation was discussed. So I was wondering, are we planning to continue this conversation somehow? And if we are, there are some things that I think might be on the list to discuss.
So I want to say two things. One of the presentations we got is a list of the county buildings, the age of the county building. Then they did add something in about when it was renovated. So there is that handout you can look at. It's pretty involved. With the transportation piece, when John Cook presented this to the Board of Supervisors last Tuesday, Kathy Hudgens did raise the issue that we didn't look at transportation. She still wants to bring that up. I think if that's something we want to do, we need to find a different path for it. I look to you talking to our chairman and our superintendent to see maybe a good way for us to do that. But this committee didn't really feel like it was a part of our job to deal with that.
Okay, well, I mean, the only reason that I would say it might be because in transportation we talk about safe routes to schools, which does have to do with our planning. Another thing that I would like us to talk about is sustainability. I know you guys didn't really talk about sustainable building or anything like that. That did not come up.
We were really focused on the resources to pay for this because it was obvious in the presentations on both sides we're falling behind in taking care of our facilities.
No, I know, and that's enough to talk about. I'm just thinking where these things might fit going forward. Are we planning to continue this committee, or is it done?
This committee is planning to be done. I say that with a smile on my face. Not that I'll just miss those days. Sandy, did you want to add something to that?
Really on a broader topic, I mean, before we go too far down the road, I do want to make the point that the Board of Supervisors has worked hard to try to find us more money. So I think rather than just saying, we don't like this and don't like that, and before we go much farther, I do want to say that they are looking at finding a way to give us $13.1 million more so we can get this out of our, the major maintenance, and whether it's a penny on the tax rate or something else, they're looking at another 20 for them and for us. So I did just want to make that point, that they did work hard to try to find us some more resources.
Were you done, Pat? I have Il-Young and then Ryan.
Thank you. Special thanks to the members on IFC working so hard over how many months? And thank you for the report. Even though there are a few places where that board might seek further clarification from the other side, or even our committee members, that overall I think you've done quite a good job to get to where we need to go. We may not be quite there yet, but we'll keep pushing. And I recall the hard conversation I had with Chairman Blova. Mr. Velka was there, and we had a committee get going, and I'm glad that I had the conversation with Chairman Blova at the time. And having said that, as the chairman of the school board, there are certain things I need to make sure that I understand this correctly for this to move forward. That it is my recollection, you could correct me, I sent an email to Madam Clerk to see whether she can find me the letter. But when I sent on behalf of the board the letter back in February of 2013, about a year ago, we were seeking a additional capital funding from FY 15, not 16, correct? And I'm hoping that, is it your understanding, and Mrs. Smith, that Board of Supervisors will address somehow by way of either, both boards, adopting the report and agreeing to the recommendations in the report, or coming up with something else that will somehow address our request made in our letter at the time they make a decision on the budget, which will be about a month and a half from now. So is that the timeline we have, like the next 6 weeks, that we have to come to a conclusion on what you want to do with this report and the recommendations?
So I'm going to say what I think, and if my two colleagues that were on the committee think differently, they can speak up. This is why I suggested to this board that when we have that joint meeting, we go forward, we still say we need to have an answer about the $25 million. Because I feel like in this committee, we did not get the answer about the $25 million. They don't want to do it. They think that when we see the pictures of the charts, and all this is online, of where they are with their debt capacity, they present it like they don't have room to give us any more money. I would tell you, we don't necessarily believe that's true. Maybe it's not 25, maybe it's 5, maybe it's 10. I don't feel like we have a clear answer about the yes or no. I know that John Cook asked Sharon Bulova, and she mentioned this at their last meeting, that she's figuring when they vote on their budget the end of April, there will be some budget follow-on as part of their motion on the budget that will affect this. Whether that's just the $13 million, whatever piece. That's the reason that this committee pushed to get this work done, because they want something out of this report to be in their next budget. So I think one of the things we have to raise at that meeting on the 18th is, what is the answer to the $25 million? Sandy?
So again, going back to the timeline, because I, as the chair, will have to schedule something if we need to have a certain thing by a certain time. So is that your understanding that they expect us to come to a decision on this report and recommendations before they adopt the budget in
That's
April?
my understanding, yes.
Which means not only do we have to have this discussion with Board of Supervisors at the joint meeting, we have to post it as a new business and then actually vote on it before their second meeting in April.
And that was one of my difficulties when I had the conversation with Susan Data, because the comment she made to me was, well, we can schedule this joint meeting after April. But really, it needs to be before they vote on their budget, which is even sooner. That I don't know how this is going to happen. Because really, when they do markup, they're done. And when is markup? The third week of April?
22nd.
22nd.
Mm-hmm.
The 18th is their markup?
By the 8th, that's a Friday, correct?
Okay.
I think the reason she doesn't think it's necessarily important to do by that timeline is because they're not intending to do this until fiscal year 16. I know, but.
And that's our problem. They're going to put, but they're going to put something in.
So Mr. Smith, for this upcoming joint meeting with the supervisor, which is going to be next Tuesday, what's your expectation for this board to come to? Are you asking us to speak in one voice by that time, or are you asking us to speak in 12 different voices?
So here's my preference, is that this board says to the full Board of Supervisors, we want a clear answer about the $25 million request from your board, not just a subset of your board? And if it's not 25 million, can you give us 5 or 10 million? I think we need to put it straight out there in public and ask them.
And we wait until we hear back from Board of Supervisors on that request before we act on the recommendations from the joint committee? Is that, I'm trying to understand the timeline.
I would tell you, part of me feels like it's going to be two separate things because the committee didn't have the authority to say yes or no about the $25 million. So I don't know that the two things are necessarily tied together.
Okay, I'm going to move
Sandy,
on. Okay, Sandy.
wanted to comment.
Just wanted to say I have a slightly different take on where we were with the 25 million, at least in this group. They were telling us it couldn't be done, and that's one of the reasons that they wanted to present to this board to tell us the reasons it couldn't be done. So we didn't agree that it couldn't be done. You know, the school system didn't agree with that. So that's a topic of conversation. We actually reworked some of the report where it had talked about the 25 million, where the original draft said something like, because it can't be done, I don't remember the exact wording, you know, we're going to do these other things. So we took that out because we didn't agree with that. You know, the FCP, you know, the school board members didn't agree with that. So I think they think they've given us a pretty definitive answer, and they're just going to explain why. So just so you have that background.
Okay, I'm going to move on to some of the questions that I have. With the $13.1 million, that is going to come out of a Board of Supervisors year-end balance. And is that going to be all depending upon their future availability of year-end balances, or am I understanding this wrong?
I think we wanted the 13.1 to come out of their year end, but I think they're going to do it the same time they do the budget.
So that's going to
And
be just
that's
a
the
line
date.
item. That's going to be a line item
To our
outside the
construction
transfer.
fund.
Outside the transfer.
Yes.
And
That's
their
our understanding.
expectation for us to set aside a similar amount in our sinking fund.
I tell you, we have such great staff members helping us. So you tell me when I'm wrong. The sinking fund, what we would take is after all of our critical requirements, whatever pot of money was left, we would take 20% of that and start putting it into the sinking fund.
Okay.
So maybe a critical requirement one year might be textbooks. It's going to be our beginning balance until they help us with that. So after we pay for all those things, say there's $5 million left, we've committed we'll take 20% of that and put it into the sinking fund.
And whether something is critical or not will be up to us.
We made that clear. Each side has to decide what's critical.
Okay, I'm going to stop for the time being. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Moon. I have Ryan.
I have to tell you that Rose is looking like I'm feeling right now. But I'll have to get you a new one. So I think we heard today, actually, that your job might not be done. We are looking at this strategic budgeting committee with the Board of Supervisors. So we'll see about that. One question that was not answered in here, and I talked with Mrs. Smith in advance that I'm still very concerned about, is how in 2012, after we submitted the request for 25 additional million, that the Board of Supervisors turn around in May, after public comment period, and designate $30 million in bond funding to Huntington for the restoration of that area. Perfectly valid cause, but how did our request go rejected, and then a month later they come up with $30 million in bond funding? So that's an outstanding question I still have. I would like to see, additionally, a document with the different statistics that you and Mr. Plattenberg have referred to that are in a different presentation, just about not only the percentage of facilities, but the different stats that go along with that. And then finally, I agree with Mrs. Smith. Once we get the answer on the 25 million, that we go back with 15 million, 10 million, until we get something.
Thank you. I have Ted.
So, Mr. McLean, I think we need to send some combat pay to these three and then rotate them back stateside. I really want to thank the three of you for the work that you've done, because we're starting to make progress. I've really felt for 26 months embarrassed that we've had no answer to this problem. And we're really making, these are concrete steps. It's not everything that we might want, but these are concrete steps. And it's very much appreciated. I have some other thoughts here, but I think they're not going to help the discussion today, so I'm just going to end with that.
Thank you. Dan?
I'm pleased with the 13 million because I think that's, and I don't have an objection to the moving some of those maintenance items to operations. I think, again, I think it's perfectly appropriate and reasonable and best accounting practice to take an asset that has a useful life far more than 5 years to have it be in a bond. So that's their preference, but I don't have an objection if they're willing to give us the money to help make that possible, then so be it. I think the issue is the core of what we've talked about here, and I'm not going to spend any more time on it, but I didn't really understand. I was not familiar with infrastructure service district. I'm familiar with some of the small area taxing authority have, but what is an infrastructure service? And I looked at it, read it in here, but I didn't really understand. I know it doesn't apply to schools, that's referenced in here, but I didn't really understand who can or what. I'm not even sure what the concept is, if it's different from like what they did the Dulles Rail stuff, where they're levying money, or they have a business district, which is where the businesses agree to tax themselves in order to provide better cleanup, et cetera, et cetera.
This discussion really started with John Faust's idea about they could add a penny to the real estate tax just for infrastructure. Mm-hmm. So it's that idea. I mean, I don't know if Jeff or anybody can explain it any further, but it's like when they added money for stormwater, or they added money for whatever.
I don't think it's a geographical district. It's a concept that, my understanding, is a concept that they can set aside certain funding out of
for a
tax
designated
revenue.
purpose. Is that the? Oh, okay. So it's really no different than giving us the money and designating, as they do now, which is for capital purposes. I guess I don't really know what it's doing in there. If it's something it doesn't sound like it's anything particularly useful to the discussion.
I think what they wanted to do was write it broadly. So this must, because it references the Virginia Code, so that's the vehicle they could use for the $20 million. So to me, that's not the so important part. Is if they have the $20 million, how do they give us some of it? Because really, the driver for this, it's apparent the needs are great. The needs are great, and they don't have enough resources to take care of all the needs. So there was a creative discussion about how can we raise funds in other ways, because we're all getting so far behind with infrastructure.
I mean, the reality is you don't have to fund buildings with bonds. I mean, you don't. So there's a whole other way, which is to obviously find resources that you spend and you go pay for a building now. I mean, those are options that we have, but they take money to do, and they take people willing to spend tax dollars for that purpose. I mean, you can argue bonds aren't the best way to do it, even though for us it's 2% financing or something ridiculous but I mean, so I understand the 10 principles of sound financial management. I get that big time, but I don't see that as a limitation. I see that as a basic approach that they're using, but we can look at other approaches, which is to pay as you go, and literally here's 1% on the tax rate, or we'll allocate X amount of dollars and we'll provide you with an additional $20 million, not for bond purposes, but for actual renovations of schools, and we won't have to fund those. So I hope we keep that discussion going. That's the core. I don't want it to be
they
limited,
do more pay as you go, but they have control over their revenue.
Right. I mean, for us, we've had this conversation. We can always take operations money if we want and put it into capital. We've not done that because we've felt really constrained by the operating resources, particularly we've had the last 5 or 6 years, is not really an option unless we want to not educate kids at the level we think they need to be educated. So, thanks.
Patty?
Thank you. I've been taking very detailed notes here, and we've identified about 20 different topics for further discussion or to note for the supervisors. And I guess at this point, I'd like to suggest that we try to figure out what we're going to do with these topics, because we still, board members, have one other topic, and staff has been waiting patiently to present information on alternative programs. So I would hope that we could wrap up. Thank you.
So I don't have 20 topics, but I've taken some notes. I had 3 go-backs, and we'll do those, and then we'll see where we are. Janie, Elizabeth, and Megan.
Okay, just some further clarifying questions. What's recommended in here are really 2 funds. One, they would allow us to have the sinking fund with the 13.1 million, but then there's the pay-as-you-go joint fund, and that's a different fund. But that pay-as-you-go could not be the result of a service district, because you can't pay for schools out of that. So that's my clarification. So this other thing, the pay-as-you-go, that would be simply funded again out of operating funds?
They wanted to leave that open and not decide exactly how they would do that, right?
So they didn't know
Because
how, where the money
they
would
didn't
come
want to
from with
say
that?
in here that they would raise the tax.
If I understand the question correctly, the sinking fund is going to be funded from initially the 13-point
Right, got that.
additional
And that's separate,
revenue.
and that would just come to us, right? But then
Okay.
there's a second fund, right?
Pay-as-you-go is not a joint fund. Pay-as-you-go is going to stay separate,
With the
right?
Board of Supervisors, and they would decide how to apportion that out.
No, pay-as-you-go is going to meet county's needs. Pay-as-go will meet our needs, but that pay-as-you, right now we have pay-as-you-go that funds regular maintenance and major maintenance. We use bond money for that infrastructure upgrade. The infrastructure upgrade will be using the sinking fund. We'll have to continue to do our pay-as-you-go with our limited resources, but in that report, it also talks about at the end of the year, if we have any available ending balance, they would like us to fund additionally into the sinking fund.
Oh, so okay, into our sinking fund? 'Cause
Yes,
this-
into
'cause this
our
is in
sinking fund.
Recommendation B is the $20 million in pay-as-you-go funding between schools, county, and parks. So that is.
Oh, that's for the service
Yeah,
district.
and that was my understanding, that according to the
So
code, they said
once
you
they,
can't.
if they decide they would determine the amount, it would be split either between county and schools or county, schools, and parks. And that amount will come into our
And so-
sinking fund.
Okay, but okay, all right, so it's not clear how they would get the money for that.
So, I mean, looking at this again, they can't call it a service
Right,
district.
that was my question.
But they're still going to find a way to do this extra $20 million.
Okay, so you figure that one out.
Supposedly.
Okay, then the other question I had is when the county was determining their needs, and so they were looking just at physical plants. In other words, with the park authority, because there is a master plan for acquiring land over time, which is a very different thing.
Janie, they looked at, it was everything. It was sidewalks, it was trails, it was roads, it was those little orphan service roads.
So they did include land needs as apart from, it wasn't just buildings, it was
But
land.
I don't know that they talked about funding that from this. They just talked about all
Yeah,
their needs.
because they have those needs, but I'm just wondering, because when we talk about the split between how much money we get from bonds, how much money they get from bonds, in their 100 and whatever, were they including their acquisition of land or other things other than just buildings?
I believe if they're using bond money, it would be
Okay.
included in that 110.
Right, so it
I'm not
was-
quite sure how the parks acquire additional land.
Right, because those are park bonds. And then the last question is, the Board of Supervisors traditionally over the years have had bonding authority that they haven't used. Have they used all their bonding authority? Because that was always a problem years ago.
I don't, yeah, they didn't cover that, but we currently have quite a bit of bonding authority that we just can't issue the
Right,
bonds.
right.
But
Okay,
bonding
and then-
authority is there.
And then the last question, because again, on the desire to stay within 10% of gross revenues to get AAA bond rating, yada, yada, yada. Since they are recognizing additional revenue in 2015, that ups the bottom line amount of gross revenues.
So was that at all discussed in, because that's what drives your debt capacity as your gross revenues increase, then your debt capacity.
They did
can go up.
reflect revenue growth when they did their projections.
Okay.
Do those revenue growth now match the revenue growth
Right,
that
that
are
was my
currently
question.
reflected? That I'm not sure.
Because that does, that's the bottom line driver in their 10 principles. Okay. Right.
Okay, Elizabeth and then Megan.
Okay. Where are you going? Where's the 13 million coming from?
Your guess is as good as
Okay.
But I did just
I
notice.
did it. I mean, it was sort of rhetorical, but not completely.
But I did just pull up their 2015 advertise for their multi-year plan, and I don't know if it's coincidence or not. However, in their 2016 plan, there is additional $13 million available.
Okay. So, hashtag just saying. So I have no problem committing money to a sinking fund, although that is the worst name ever for a construction fund, ever, of 20% of whatever's left over, because 20% of zero is a big fat zero. So have at it. In fact, I say we commit 40%. I think we upped the game a little bit. The one thing that IFC didn't talk about, and I've made mention of it time and again, and I know it's a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but not completely. We have, under Virginia Code, the ability to just give the buildings to the supervisors. Just have them own it. Have them own all the facilities. Don't take any bonding authority from them and let them own it. Take the monkey off our back. And do you know how quickly the spotlight would turn to the supervisors on the condition of the facilities of our schools? So I am not altogether tongue-in-cheek on saying, you know what? You guys have the bonding money. You have the decision. You have only 19% of the real property square footage right now. All the questions of the proportional disbursement of bonding monies, you know what? Let's just stop. Let's just, that is a big old giant ball back in their court. So, I think it's something that we, if this continues to take up this much of this board's time, it is a very real and likely scenario. The other possibility is a variation on a theme of IFC is put all of the public square footage into a joint committee of the boards, and that the money is run jointly between the boards. So that there's not this, division line between the two. The real property is the real property, and no county facility that is, 15 or 20 years old should be renovated before West Springfield High School or Falls Church, ad nauseum. And that's where we highlight, we shrink the field of play, change the conversation completely, and say, you want to not hear about our capital needs anymore? You want to not hear about 900 and moving on to 1,000 trailers anymore? Own it.
Oh, scares me. Megan?
Okay, I absolutely think that Elizabeth is raising a very valid, position to consider having. It's almost like, can we ask the IFC to have a post-mortem conversation and say, hey, by the way, or we just bring it up in our joint meeting with them. But barring that radical approach, I did want to tell my colleagues that just like we had earlier today, this discussion about the board of supervisors and this volleyball game we have with them where, we went to them and said, we need 25 million more. from their perspective, they think this report says, well, we didn't give you 25, but we've got a solution to get you 23. So what made me concerned is I started to hear my colleagues saying, we still want to go for 25, and if not, then 15, then 10. Here's my worry. They're going to go, what part of 23 million did you not get? So just to make sure we're clear when we're talking with each other and the other boards, what are you all thinking? Because in my mind, 23 was their IFC recommendation of, we can't get you 25 more, but we can get you 23. And if people are thinking 23 plus still push for 25, I'm confused and I'm on this board. So can somebody clarify for me why we're still talking about pushing for 25 when they've given us, here's how we think you can get 23?
Pat?
Well, I hear you. I guess I had a couple of questions. How far behind are we in our infrastructure needs? I mean, how much do we need more to catch up?
We need about $274 million a year.
Okie dokie. So
We
that's
get
probably why
150.
we're talking about 23 plus 25.
Do you understand the reason we formed this committee is because we said we want another 25. So now that they show us, here's how we think we can get to 23, and we go, oh, but we still need 25 more. We know we need $270 million. But we made a decision as a board to go forward saying we want 25 million more.
I guess I'm disagreeing with your premise. I didn't think that the point of this task force, this committee, was just to find out the 25. I thought it was to begin that dialogue that we haven't had yet between both boards, where we talk about our combined infrastructure needs, what we can do, what we haven't been able to do. That was not my understanding of the purpose of this committee. It was just
But
to
it was
find
prompted.
25 million.
It was prompted by this board saying we think we need 25 million more, and then they said, "Fine, let's come to the table." It was not suddenly, "Hey, can you get us 50, 75, 100 million more?"
So, Megan, this is the question that I don't think was answered clearly enough. And it's a question this board has had since I've been on the board. The county talks about being under the 10%. What isn't ever clear enough is what can they increase and still be safely enough under the 10%, but help us take care of our needs. And I think this board needs a clear answer about that.
I thought that was one of the primary goals of the IFC, was to finally have that, because that is the volleyball game. We keep saying, you have wiggle room to give us more bond money. And they keep saying, you people don't understand how we keep our bond rating as it is. So I thought that actually was we want 25 million more. And they were supposed to say, well, if we can't increase the bond amount, then here's how we do it another way.
Sandy?
I would agree with that. I mean, what started it was our request for the 25 million. And at one point, we were told, well, that's off the table. And, we kept coming back and saying, well, we see it differently. We don't think it is. But, so they did come up with other things. And they were creative. And so, we do need to be appreciative of the thought and the effort. But, we are still, the fact of the matter is we're short $100 million a year in what we need. So I think this wasn't just focused on that, because if it was just focused on that 25 million, it was broader. How can we find a way to finance our needs?
But Kathy's correct. The question was asked. They keep saying we can't raise that bond amount, and Kathy said, okay, well, but why? Because when we do our calculations, we think there is a little bit of wiggle room there. And I'm disappointed that in 9 months of work, the county didn't provide clarity for you guys as a committee on why.
Oh, they did. No, they oh yes, they told us their perspective. I mean, we definitely got.
So in
their
other words,
point of
after
view.
sitting at the table together, they gave an explanation, but we don't think the explanation's accurate.
We have a different view of it. We just have a different view, and
Well-
so that's one of the things that they're going to present to our entire board. They're going to present to all of us, because they want everybody on the school board to hear what we heard.
Okay.
About their rationale. And then we can have a discussion about
So
it.
you're just preparing us that the answer's not going to necessarily shed light.
Well, it's what I would say, yeah.
It's informative.
Maybe Kathy can answer this better than I have, but, I just think
I can
we have a
answer.
different perspective on the answer.
Yeah, I mean, what it's going to do is going to provide the insight that they gave us. And the bottom line is, when the questions are asked about the delineation about what that represents between that 10% cap and where it currently resides, the answers become, well, when we do additional projects and the economic conditions change, that 10% can adjust upward and downward. So therefore, we're fearful, given the current economic trends and where we've been, that we don't have any additional latitude in that gap. Now, me, linear sequential, would like to know, tell me what that gap is. Give me the dollar amount. Let me make my own assessment about what you've given me, but delineate that with exacting numbers. Unfortunately, I wasn't given that opportunity because that pretty much carried the day. Now, do I have a problem with that? No, not totally, because that is the answer that they gave us.
Thank you.
I just wanted to add that, when we look at the numbers now and maybe another year or two, there is that room. I think they're concerned about few years out going forward that they will get much closer to that 10%. And then obviously the revenue projections are conservative and,
And I forgot something else that wasn't brought up that Charlie Dane had mentioned previously, was that it didn't take into account the Economic Development Authority bonds and how that affects our indebtedness, and that the county had used some $620 million to our $150. So not only do you have the disparity on the general obligation bonds, but you also have it exacerbated with the Economic Development Authority bonds. So, I mean, it really is a big equation and a big number.
the debt service on those EDA bonds are considered when they do that ratio.
Okay. So this is where I kind of feel like we are. We're going to have the meeting with the supervisors on the 18th, March 18. I hope we all feel versed enough to have that discussion with them about it. I think raising some of these points here. What I don't know about the meeting on the 18th is how they're going to divide the discussion between how much we have time and how detailed the budget is and how much time there is for this. And I think we are going to have another follow-up meeting. I have a couple of takeaways that I think that, hopefully our staff will help me formulate questions to their staff. The piece we really need to understand is that whole 110 versus 155 compared to the square feet and what they cover in the bonding. So we'll get an answer about that. There's been questions about the age of the buildings and this idea of ours compared to theirs. That's a really hard part of the apple to bite off. It just really is, because it's so different. So I don't know how to get a better answer about that. I really don't. The other thing was the whole square foot cost for them compared to us. Maybe we can do something about that. So, I'll try to pull together some of that information and get it to you guys. But I think the next step that's going to inform us is that joint meeting where we kind of hear what questions come from them and then see if we can move forward with this. So if we're okay with that, I think I don't know if we're going to put it on the 20th for new business. I look to the chairman.
We can always, put it as a new business and then postpone or remove it. But if we don't put it on, and if we have to take an action by the first meeting in April, it will be too late, because we want to give the public an opportunity to comment on the actions we'll be taking on. So therefore, I am predisposed put this as a new business for the next board meeting, and then action in the first meeting in April, and then see how the discussion on Tuesday goes.
Okay, that sounds good. So that would be a next step, to put it for new business March 20. I will get the answer to that, get help formulating my question about the 110 versus the 155 and the whole square foot part of that, and get that to the supervisors, to the county side, to get an answer on that. Sandy?
The motion then that will be new business will be for us to accept the report. Is that right? Is that what the motion
I think accept. I don't think we want to look at approving it. Correct, Mr. Moon?
So we will accept, is that what the motion will be, to accept the
The
report?
motion would be to accept the report.
That will be the motion, but I certainly expect more comments and possibly some amendments to that.
Okay.
Right.
All right.
What happened
And-
to the idea of amending or doing the addendum that we talked about?
I think that's definitely a possibility, that there's going to be certain areas where we're going to want to add something.
Okay.
That I think that's fine. I think that we're going to know more after the 18th and when we find out when there's a joint meeting with the Board of Supervisors, too.
So, Mr. Schultz, in order to answer your question, that main motion will be to accept the IFC's report and recommendations, but I do certainly expect comments and probably, amendments to that.
Okay, all right. Well, can I get a clarification on that? Are you suggesting that the best way for us to go about that is supply each individual amendments, or are we just going to try to have one kind of amendment? Like one amendment that encompasses the things that we've talked about today, and then if anybody wants to amend that, then they can do. But I would start with, otherwise we're just going to have 12 people working in different directions.
I agree with you.
Okay, so, either the IFC Joint Committee can do it, or, I'm happy to help to. But, I think that there should be a cohesive voice around one set of amendments that we choose with our voice, and then if there's anything that somebody wants to add independently from that, then you're welcome to do that. But I don't. I
So
see it as
I'll
fruitless.
take the lead on ensuring that the concerns of our board get listed as an addendum that we'll put to the report.
Thank you.
Okay, Sandy?
If we're about ready to wrap up, I just wanted to say that we owe Mrs. Smith a real debt of gratitude for her chairing this committee. It was a tremendous amount of work, and she did an excellent job. So.
Thank you. I appreciate all the work of my colleagues and staff that helped us, and I want it to be noted, we had 2 hours and we only took less than an hour and a half. Yeah.
Mrs. Smith, who knows that, both boards may decide to ask the IFC to continue their work. So don't consider this to be the end of your assignment.
Kathy needs to be on the board.
Kathy, can I just make one last comment? I do think it's a good idea to at least acknowledge and put a list together of what we've talked about for future discussions and deliberations. There was some very excellent discussion here today, and I would hate to lose any of it. So that's my first comment. And second, back to something Megan said probably an hour and a half ago now, and that is that my sense of that small group was that they expect us to be grateful. So in other words, if we go in there and say, we asked for 25, you only are giving us 13, that's going to make them very angry. So I'm just saying, again, back to the discussion earlier too, it's like, what, it's all in how we present it. And maybe it isn't everything we asked for, but it's greater than zero. And so again, I'm just putting that out there because I feel very strongly about that they, and in fact, it was almost a few times where we had to say, hey, thank you, we are grateful, because they were getting very upset with us, I think, when we kept trying to go back. So I know it's a straddle that we...
Yeah, I agree. Dan?
Huzzah.
Just if you could get somebody to put together the the county's full faith and credit portion, which is what the AAA bond rating goes to versus other stuff. And Susan Quinn and I have been having a conversation about the EDA bonds. If you look at all those bonds that are floated, we're looking at just this much of it. So I just want to make sure that in your discussions as a committee here, at least you address that as part of the amendments or whatever else we need. If we need more information on that, I'd like to include it. Thanks. Right. We looked at funding South County Middle School with EDA bonds. And it was only going to be like maybe 1% more interest. Less than that, it wasn't significant. So.
All right, Mrs. Smith, are we finished? Hooray. Well, there are no breaks for this group. We're going right into...
I think we
Don't you-
still
do you,
take
Mr.
a couple
Chair?
of minutes for
Do
the
we?
change.
Oh, all right.
Okay. So we'll start at 6 o'clock sharp. 6 o'clock sharp.
6 o'clock sharp, and we'll get ready.